So we need to give everyone like 30 seconds to join the stream, say hi, talk about things. So we should shoot the breeze for a little bit before getting into we don't talk about
Why do we not talk about Uno? Or is that an in-joke that I'm missing?
You haven't got kids, obviously.
Yeah, that's
right, okay. That's the other Uno.
Right, to the point where, in our internal system, it's a punishment to say
it. Just watch Encanto when you get a chance.
Right,
yeah.
Well, the most confusing thing for me is a good mate of mine runs Uno Homes, home loans, and so when I talk about Uno, I have to be careful about which sort of cohort of my friends that I'm talking about and which one I'm talking about. Because
do you get confused by the burger ad ones that go Uno, and you're like, wait, mobile develop it?
A little, yeah.
They're so excited.
That would imply that I watch live TV, which I don't. So I don't generally see those. Although they're starting to creep into the YouTube ads these days.
All right. So actually, we should, since we were talking about it before, MS Build has just been and gone. Nick, you kind of watched it while we sleep,
right?
Yeah, I'm sure you were up at 3 a.m. local time to watch it or whatever it was. But did you pick up anything interesting from there?
Look, I think that the interesting thing from sort of a client app development is that obviously there were very big announcements around Maui GA and sort of the go live of that. I think that they've been on a very interesting journey over the last sort of 18 to 24 months. When Xamarin Forms was basically the cornerstone of our business for a while, and so to see that evolve into sort of Maui and where they're taking that is quite interesting. And we'll talk about this a little in the session, is that, there's different approaches to cross-platform development. And there's horses for courses, so it fits into some molds and it doesn't fit into others. So,
Yes, Alan, YouTube has ads, by the way. But yeah.
How about you, Richard? What did you pick out from?
So we were just talking before we came on air about DevBox, which is kind of interesting. The GitHub code spaces, but for Windows machines, if you want to kind of look at it sideways. So for those who play with code spaces, it's kind of like VS Code working in a dev container, which is awesome. But just effectively, it's somewhat limited in terms of what you can do with it, because you are literally working in a container. So you don't have a UI. You're not really able to do some of the Visual Studio IDE things because of the remote connection approach that VS Code uses for remote dev, container dev. And there's some other constraints around it that don't quite fit. And DevBox is this idea of effectively you take a VM image that is constantly re-provisioned or refreshed with changes in source code, so that for a new dev or when you want to refresh your machine, you literally go, give me a new dev box, effectively a virtual machine. And it's got your code on there. It's pulled things down. It's got the latest tools, whatever else that your team uses. But you're doing it in the cloud. So you've got some security as well. So around, for organizations such as the one I'm at, where we're concerned about endpoint security and making sure we know where our code is and trying not to let it leak out of the network, so to speak, gives us a good control of that, but also gives us the flexibility to have potentially cheap machines running on people's desks with overpowered boxes in the cloud that we're running for maybe the typical 8 hours a day, and then we shut down for the rest of the 16 hours. 8 hours a day? No, that's not my team. I want the other way around. 12 hours a day. Work slaves. And then save costs while it's not running. And so kind of spreading that. And if the hardware changes, you get automatic refresh. So you're not doing the typical IT purchasing policy of, oh no, you've got to wait till your laptop's 15 years old before you can get a refresh, because that's the cycle. And I don't care that you spilled coffee on it on purpose. Just live with it. And so, being able to do some of those things as well. And I think the other part that's really nice is that they're taking this approach of having a pool of things so that if you've got people around the globe, you can run effectively these VMs in the closest data center. So our RDP, remote desktop ping time problem, which is a nightmare if you've done this anywhere else, should theoretically be good. And then, so keep an eye on that one. See what happens with that. So I thought that was interesting. James, did you look at all?
Don't put me on the spot, Richard.
Yeah. The answer is no. No, I did not.
I may or may not have.
I
can neither confirm nor deny the presence of build information.
But that was the other comment that we made before we jumped on, is that, you know, a lot of those sessions are very polished. They're material that you can go and watch at your leisure when you want. There's no reason to be up at 3 a.m. to watch them. You know, it's not like you're going to be hot off the press, you know, reporting for work the next day with blends of information that you're going to fly straight at work. You know, I mean, it's the type of stuff that, I mean, it's preview stuff, and a lot of it anyhow, and it's sort of like what's coming down the line and stuff. So
yeah,
you know, a lot of great material, but it's sort of, you know,
there's actually they do a big book of news. I should find it quickly and stick the link in the chat, but big book of news, build 22, and it's like ridiculous amount of stuff in there. A lot of Azure things that have turned up.
Well, they GA'd Azure container apps, right? And so
there's a whole lot of stuff that's been in preview. They GA'd finally.
I mean, what's particularly interesting about that, and not that I spend that much time in that world anymore, is that it's kind of bringing together a lot of the sort of the container story that Microsoft's had in Azure, because there's been a ton of different options. You know, whether you are using app services that are essentially, you know, they wrap the container very nicely for developers that don't want to manage it, right? So it's auto scale, it's auto provision, but by the same token, you give up some of that level of control. And then on the other side, you've got like hosted Kubernetes type thing, which, you know, I have no interest in learning, and I don't want to learn. I just want to host my web app, right? And it's sort of like, do I want to pay somebody to do it? No, because it's something that's almost commodity these days. And it's sort of like, so container apps is kind of like trying to find that middle ground where, you know, as a dev, I can build my container, I can then provision it, and you know, it does the nice things like auto scale and stuff like that.
Andrew, no multiple monitors with DevBox. No, you should be able. It's remote desktop. If you've got multiple monitors locally, I'm pretty sure.
You think so?
If lets you spread the session across both monitors.
Yeah.
So you can still do that, or just, you know, spin up 2 dev boxes. That's overkill, probably. But I did just put the link for that big book of news in the chat, so feel free to have a flick through that. There's a chunk in there. Lots of AI and ML stuff, by the way. Lots of involvement there. Actually, really interesting one. You probably saw this in the keynote. Meta is doing Facebook is doing something with ML models or some AI things, and they're basically using Azure as the hardware provider for that, and they've got a 5,400 80 gig GPUs in a farm that they can use for doing things.
Jesus.
So if you want to know where the global supply of cards has gone lately, 5,400. Oh wait, here it is. 5,400 GPUs using A100 V4 NVIDIA Tensor Core 80 gigabyte GPUs for AI research.
Also, they can serve you better ads.
Yeah.
Also,
as you better in the photos.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, shall we get into it, James?
I guess so. Do you want to share, Nick?
Yeah, mate.
Oh, hang on. We have the JetBrains competition as usual. So
you became a Kiwi for a second then. That was nice. JetBrains.
It was just the connection.
Yeah.
So any of the JetBrains licenses said very clearly, and I'll remember I'll pay attention during the talk like you will as well, and I'll note down questions. And at the end, I'll ask, and whoever answers first gets the licenses for each of the 2 questions. 1 license per person only. All right.
Correct.
Nick, you
formalities out of the way.
Let's see if that's going to come through.
Looking good. All right, I'll pop it up. Go. Here we are. On the top. Here's the most important. Well, I'll put me at the bottom. There you go. You're more important.
Well, you can cover yourself when you put the questions up on screen this time.
I'll do something secret behind it. All right. Sorry, Nick. Over to the professional part of the presentation.
Yeah, why did you employ me? Yeah, that's right. Hey everyone, so for those who don't know me, I'm Nick Randolph. I run a company called Built to Roam. We've been doing sort of mobile cross-platform stuff for the last decade or so. And tonight's session is going to be looking at WinUI everywhere. Well, actually, it's the Uno platform, and not to be confused with Maui or Avalon or any of those other cross-platform tools. Feel free to chuck some comments up. I'm sure Richard and James will interrupt me if there's something that needs an answer, but I'm happy to be interrupted and we'll have a conversation along the way. So let's get into it. And I'll start this, hopefully as soon as PowerPoint responds, by looking at the problem domain. And this kind of falls into a number of buckets. I mean, the obvious one being, we have multiple platforms out there, whether it be Windows, macOS, Linux, etc. And we want to build apps for them. And we don't really want to have to build them multiple times. Back 5 years ago, we were probably building an iOS app and an Android app and not really thinking much about Windows. But, with the resurgence of the PC, building for Mac and Windows and Linux is becoming sort of ever more important. And of course, we don't really want to be doing web development, although we kind of have to. And so particularly in the enterprise, it would be good to have a solution that allows us to build the same thing and have it run across all of these platforms. Sort of a couple of other sort of dimensions on this problem are that, we might have an existing app. It might be a WPF app or a WinForms app, and we want to bring that forward to using the latest bits. And so, Microsoft hasn't done a particularly good job of migrating those technologies. They've had a couple of stabs at things like Silverlight and UWP and some other technologies that we no longer talk about.
I've forgotten.
Windows 8, Windows 9. But the idea is that, there's got to be a future for those technologies. And so there are parts of Microsoft that are investing back in those technologies. So, with the latest version of Visual Studio, there's a new designer for both WPF and for WinForms. So those technologies are not going anywhere. But by the same token, if you want to take advantage of, the latest and greatest in terms of, the Windows platform, then you need to sort of be on what is now Windows UI or the Windows App SDK, formerly known as the long-lived dead platform of UWP. Endless debate.
Not twisted at all, right?
That's right. Yes, it hasn't impacted me at all.
No.
Yes. Which actually interestingly leads me to the last one, which is talking about skills and sort of ongoing, resourcing for doing this kind of development. And so, again, sort of 5 or 6 years ago, a company might have hired an iOS developer or 3, an Android developer or 10, and had to rebuild the app multiple times. But we don't really want to be doing that. We don't really want to have to invest heavily into somebody who knows the inner workings of all of these technologies to do the bulk of our code, right? Sure, sometimes, you may need to know the nitty-gritty of how things work on iOS or Android to fix a particular problem. But the majority of your app, again, particularly in the enterprise setting, is very cookie cutter. It's like a form, it's like a wizard, it's like, it's kind of like page after page of development. And you don't want to be paying a premium for developers that have got very niche skills. And so, the idea is that if you can have a single platform that your developers are skilled on, then, it means that you can get the bulk of that development done without having to employ a lot of these specialists. And so this brings us to what is the Uno platform. And so back in the days of UWP, the Uno team recognized that there was what Microsoft had come up with in terms of XAML and C# and that sort of separation between the UI and the sort of logic layer was quite compelling. And as you can imagine, there was a bunch of devs that have been, come from Silverlight or Windows Phone development, and like that approach, and wanted to take it to the other platforms. And so sort of that was the basis of Uno, and the idea here is that it's now based on the exact same XAML that is the basis of WinUI. And in fact, when you build an Uno platform Windows app, it is actually Windows UI or the WinApp SDK. So there is no abstraction there for the Windows platform. And so the idea is that that's kind of used as a stencil for all of those other platforms. So now when you're building for iOS or Android or macOS or Linux, essentially you're building the exact same code. So it's the same XAML, it's the same C#, and it just runs on those other platforms. The other problem that they sought to tackle was the need to use or to build an app that was pixel perfect. And so one of the limitations we often found with Xamarin Forms is that you build these apps that would, for the most part, be the same across all of the platforms, but they didn't look exactly the same. One had rounded corners on one platform, square corners on the other, some gradients and shading on one and not on another. And so you kind of had to spend a lot of time if you wanted them to look pixel perfect the same. And so one of the core pillars of Uno is that they aim to have that pixel perfect, exact same UI on the various platforms. And there's other parts of what is now the Uno platform, and we'll go through some of these in detail. We've got, a building on that core foundation of XAML.NET, C# backend. We've now got, the ability to support themes. So, for example, if you wanted your app to be styled like the latest material, you can do that just by applying the material themes. If you want it to style like an iOS app, you can use the Cupertino theme. And then, the teams started to build out some other components to build out the more platform aspects of things. So there's a bunch of extensions that help with things like navigation, with data binding, reactive extensions, things like that. There's investment into controls, using the toolkit, which opens it up to make it easier to put things like a navigation bar or tab bars, the things that don't exist in a very cross-platform nature, to try and consolidate those into a single sort of UI that you can build and it works anywhere. And so we'll drop in and talk about the tools and in particular what the team's doing around Figma and the design side of things as well as we get into it. So. And so this is kind of where Uno fits in the sort of the cross-platform landscape. When we talk about cross-platform, and there's a lot of different dimensions we can look at. What I've typically talked to in the past is this sort of spectrum from web development on one end through to native development on the other. I don't want to delve too much into that, but if we isolate it and look at these tools that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years that really allow you to target all of these platforms and yet still provide a native level experience, then it kind of comes down to a group of 4 or 5. And so we've got tools that take an approach where they treat everything as a canvas. So we've got things like Flutter and Avalonia that really look at the canvas and then decide to draw on it their own way. And then there's other sort of toolkits like React and Xamarin Forms / Maui that use the native controls as the basis of their rendering, and then style them accordingly. Uno kind of fits in the middle ground. It is capable of doing some, canvas rendering. So, for example, if you want to build your own control, you can definitely do that. You can put a skier canvas there, you can build out control yourself. But it also leverages the native rendering engine to use sort of the native platform controls. So things like a text box will be the native text box across all the platforms. And that gives us a bunch of benefits like accessibility and things like that. But on top of that, we've got this notion of lookless controls. And what we mean by that is essentially a control that has a built-in set of behaviors or functionality, and it can be restyled. So it has a control template, and you can go and change sort of virtually every aspect about the way that control looks without actually changing its behavior. And so that leads it very well to styling in XAML, using a bunch of styles and templates and stuff, and yet still giving you this cross-platform capability. So, for example, here's a basic grid. So this is XAML for those who haven't seen any of it. So we've basically got a grid, and inside the grid, we've got a text block and a slider, and the two are essentially data bound together. So as you move the slider, the text block will update with the corresponding thing. Corresponding value. And sort of this is a selection of the platforms that are currently supported. Now, if the demo gods are going to play nice, I'm going to switch to my virtual machine.
No chance at all.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so every good demo starts with the command line, right? And for those who know me, I know that I don't spend very much time in the command line, but we are going to new up a new app using the .NET New templates. There are Visual Studio templates as well, but for the purpose of this, I'm going to show you the .NET New templates.
Yeah.
And this is actually so there are actually two packs of extensions for Uno. There's the sort of the main Uno templates, which you'd use to get a very vanilla application out of the box. It basically has the main targets, so iOS, Android, Windows, etc., as individual projects. And then it gives you a single page that you can then build your app out from. The second pack of templates is the Uno extensions, and this is the sort of the extensions we'll talk about what comes as part of extensions a bit later on. But the idea here is that the templates as part of that pack are a more realistic example of an application that you might want to build. So we'll go ahead and do those, and I'll just walk you through the structure of the app. So you can see it's generated it, and it's done a bunch of restores to actually hopefully
restore failed.
Yeah. I know.
Right.
It's like fail. Actually, most of them okay, but yeah, we'll see. Nothing like trying to get NuGet to behave. So let's just boot this in Visual Studio. And so what we should see is Solution Explorer that has different projects for each of our targets. By target, so I use interchangeably targets or head projects. And by those, I basically mean the platforms that we're going to be going to address. Now, what's interesting about this is you would have seen in the command line, what I was specifying here, if we scroll back up, is our Net 6 templates. And the reason why that's important is that Microsoft, as part of the GA for MAUI, have obviously been working on Net 6 support for mobile, so iOS, Android, and of course Mac. And so what we're seeing here is in this project, we only have a single head project for mobile. And if I open that, you can see that the target frames are Android, iOS, Catalyst, and macOS. They're all packaged into that one thing. And so then what you have is the remainder of the Uno targets that are that aren't part of that single project. And long term, potentially, we might see that Microsoft makes that sort of single project more extensible so that we can include those other targets. But right now, they sit separately from that underneath this platforms node. The other things that we have in here is we've got two other projects at the bottom here. And so you can think of these as the breakup of the UI. So this UI project basically contains our XAML views, so main page, second page, etc. And then this other project basically contains our view models. And so you can think this is typically a class library, so it doesn't have any strong ties to the UI. And the idea there is that most of that stuff can be unit tested, which we have a unit testing project for. And similarly for the UI, we have a UI test. Okay, so we can run up the WASM head, and we can actually run it and get the UI test to step through that experience and validate that it's correct. And so the idea here is that this sort of template provides you a good structure for your application. It also does a bunch of things in terms of wiring up the entry point for our app. And so for those who have built a Windows app, we've been familiar with sort of the app.xaml as our entry point. And what we've added to that is basically this app.xaml.host file. And you can see here, if you come from sort of the ASP space, you can kind of see some of the sort of the host builder kind of syntax creeping in here. And so this is based on the work that Microsoft has done in the Microsoft extensions library. So they put a lot of work into that. And then the Uno team have taken that and have built out a capability of actually embedding this within our app. And so what this gives us behind the scenes is the ability to have a DI container. And so when we're sort of newing up our view models, we can inject a bunch of services and things like that into it. So for example, if I look at my main view model, you can see here that I've got things like a navigator being injected into there, which gives me the ability to sort of navigate around in our application. I've also got configuration information being injected here. And of course, if I've got my own custom services, I can go ahead and register those and actually have those exposed in here. So very similar to what you'd expect to see if you're coming from the web space in terms of adding things to a DI container and then having them sort of newed up for you with all of the sort of the relative dependencies all created for you. So that's the basis of that. Just to make sure that I'm not talking rubbish here, let's actually set this as a startup project and actually see some code in action. And while that's booting, what I'll actually show you is just the main page of the app. Right, so it's very simple. Essentially, we have a nav bar, and so this actually comes from the Uno toolkit library, and then we've got a singular button in the middle of the screen. And what we should see is that our button in the middle of the screen actually has these nice rounded edges. And that's because behind the scenes, we've also wired in the material design language. And so the idea here is that if I click to there, it goes to the second page, and our nav bar at the top has this sort of built-in back experience. And obviously, this works for some apps. It won't work for all of them. And you can customize that experience.
You got a mobile emulator local as well?
Let me hang.
I'm throwing you off your tangent now. It's like, let's go off script.
I'm getting there. So hang on, let's see if we can get the genius here. Let's just pair to Mac. Connect. I knew that it was going to be one fail. Let's see.
That was me, Richard.
Oh,
no.
Wait.
So that ain't going to work. However, what we should be able to do is we should be able to use my not even lighting
Android emulator.
I was going to say it should light up my Android emulator. Let's just set that as a target.
It was there somewhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not picking up the target framework. However, let me just switch here for a second. So this is a different project. I was going to show it later on. But in theory, I should be able to...
Oh no, I've thrown the order out completely.
So this one actually is connected to the emulator. It seems to be working fine.
Just the usual delay while things get pushed into emulators.
Yeah. So actually, while that's doing its thing, let me just show you. Let's show you the WASM head.
Thank you, Teaspoon. I'm proud.
We'll come back to Richard's example in a second. So let me just show you the WASM head.
Can you show it on Linux now?
WSL, maybe.
Yes, I should be able to run that head too. So this is the WASM, and so same kind of look and feel. The navigation is exactly the same. The styling is exactly the same, and there's no custom logic for that. I mean, it's all basically the same. This XAML is basically what drives all of that. And okay, let's see if we can prove a point and actually pick up the GTK and set that as our starter project.
Yes. Here we go. Hold on to your pants, everyone.
Does this mean I can say I'm a Linux developer now?
Linux is going to win on the desktop. Everyone knows that.
Yes, that's right.
Imagine all the hate mail I'm now going to get. Those 3 Linux users are going to be so on top of me.
There we go. GTK head, which is essentially running on WSL. And it's running slowly because I've got the debugger set running, and it's got a bunch of log outputs for the GTK build. So it's struggling a little bit. Oh, look at that, some styling problems. We've got to fix that.
Ooh.
Yes. Anyway, functionally, it's still there. And let's see if our other app. Okay, so our other app did spin up, and we'll come back to this one in a sec. But essentially, this is it. This is the other app running in the Android emulator.
Cool.
And I'm not quite sure why this head did not. Let me just one more time. It's not. It's just
chat
not
channel's going off today. It's great.
It's just not going to play ball today. Okay, let's leave that for a couple of minutes, and we'll come back to the slides. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a look down history lane just for a second, because the story behind Uno is quite interesting. Because as I mentioned, it came out of the stuff that Microsoft had been done in the sort of the XAML space, and so the tool's actually quite old. It was about 2013 when it was sort of inspired, and since then they've sort of progressively ramped up to where we are. And you can see a number of the milestones along the way. Over the last sort of 12 months, we've done a lot of updates. So now we're sort of averaging somewhere between 6 and 8 updates a year, with the latest one being the update to 4.0, which was at UnoConf last year. And so they've just announced 4.3, which basically is the version that now has the .NET Mobile sort of RTM support. So if you're building a new app today, that's what you pick up. In terms of licensing, the Uno platform itself is free, and the model is very similar to sort of the Red Hat paid enterprise support model. So there's a number of customers that do want that level of support. And what I find really interesting about this is that people talk about the fact that they want a Microsoft solution, and the Microsoft solution is always going to be built in, and it's sort of like the way to go. But the interesting thing that they forget is that Microsoft really doesn't have an enterprise support agreement. Well, it kind of does, but it's like you really need to sign up to the program for proper enterprise support, which is kind of really expensive and not a great model anyhow. And even then, you're not guaranteed experts on, say, Maui or Xamarin Forms, etc. Whereas the paid model for Uno platform is that you get to basically engage with the team through their paid enterprise support model. Okay, what's interesting is Microsoft is by default the largest.
Just before you jump into that question in the chat, the WebAssembly version, is it a SPA? There you go. And WinForms is actually meant to mean ASP.NET Forms, which I think means web forms, but just to add to confusion.
No, he meant ASP.NET Forms. Here we go. Yes, web.
Yeah.
Yes, not to be confused with WinForms, which is what I was originally talking about, which is really old technology from Microsoft. Yes. So the web model is WebAssembly. So effectively it is a SPA.
But it packages up as a SPA. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. But it's and essentially you can run it anywhere, right? So there's no need to run it on a .NET backend. I mean, it's a SPA, so you can literally host it on anything that can serve up HTTP. So which is great. The only penalty you kind of pay is that there isn't that sort of initial download for WebAssembly, and so Blazor pays that tax as well, and it's definitely something that the Microsoft and the team that's investing in the future of the web platform is definitely conscious of. So as we get into the Net 7 timeframe, where there's a common base for both Blazor and for what the Uno team are working on, we'll see some improvements there to improve the download and the startup time for it. Yes, Uno is probably here to stay. For sure.
Even more than Silverlight.
Yes, that's right.
Wow, we said Silverlight twice in one night.
Silver what? Yes.
Yes,
it's only slightly less dead than UWP, Richard. Okay. So Microsoft is by default the sort of the largest code contributor to the Uno platform, which is entirely open source. So Microsoft basically, what Uno platform is based on the actual source code that is coming from the WinUI platform. So sort of, there's a lot of cross collaboration that goes. So for example, the daytime picker, basically it's taken almost verbatim, it comes across and gets engaged into the platform. And then obviously there's some adaptation that needs to be done for the various platforms, but on the whole, because the core is there in terms of the support for XAML, the control templating and stuff like that, a lot of it comes across and can just run, which is really good for third-party libraries, right? So if you look at, say, Infragistics or Syncfusion that have had controls for UWP and WinUI, those controls can actually be migrated across quite well to the Windows platform. So, and things like the community toolkit that Microsoft has, so the Windows community toolkit, there is a port of that that supports the Uno platform. And because it's running .NET, any of your standard sort of Net Standard 2.0 libraries, and now that mobile is on Net 6, any of your Net 6 libraries will also come across and work as well.
Question from Andrew, just quickly pop it in there. So if Nick could say a few words about how Uno compares to Avalonia, that would be nice.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll try not to get ridden over by the Maui bus as well. Yeah, look, I think the positioning is interesting. So Avalonia have taken the direction that they sort of started at the foundation of WPF and sort of built out their very stylized or their interpretation of XAML going forward. And so they're a platform onto their own. They are an abstraction over every platform, whereas Uno takes the WinUI platform for Windows and then abstracts for the other platforms. Look, at the end of the day, they're both competitors in the same market. Different people prefer different platforms. I think that all of the technologies in this space are all fostering an ongoing development. So, like even the stuff that Maui is doing, there are parts of that will build on the community. So the work that they've invested into the single project will benefit both Avalonia and the Uno platform. And some of the stuff that Avalonia is doing in terms of some of the rich controls that they're working on definitely inspires the team at Uno to do some of their best work as well. So look, I'm definitely not going to engage on a conversation about which one's better than the other. Uno is the platform that I tend to use for my stuff. But I think that, there are definitely cases where I would recommend, teams sticking with Xamarin Forms or Maui, particularly if they're a .NET shop, particularly in a space that, they might be a small team and they are, they just want to get something rapidly up and running. But if they're interested in a more sophisticated set of technologies, one that could be heavily styled to meet the branding requirements of the company, then I would suggest that looking at Avalonia and Uno platform. And I guess the only thing I'd say in Uno's favor is that they are probably the leader when it comes to the number of platforms that are supported in production today. Take it or leave it. That's my 2 cents worth on that. So the other interesting thing that the Uno team's been working on is what is the platform part of it. So when we refer to the Uno platform, the Uno bit is basically the cross-platform capability, and the platform pieces are all of the other bits of tooling and the capabilities that they're bringing to the table. And so the last section of this sort of PowerPoint, I want to go and touch on just some of the stuff that they're doing, particularly to support end-to-end development. And so we'll start off by looking at design, and this is quite hard. Microsoft invested in this very heavily, back in the days of Silverlight and WPF, even into the sort of the Windows 8, Windows Phone timeframe, with their investment into things like Blend and obviously XAML. The idea behind that was that we as humans weren't supposed to read XML. We weren't supposed to read XAML. And one of the things I'm told all the time about XAML is that
that worked out well, didn't it?
Yeah. It turns out that humans actually can write XAML quite quickly, particularly with IntelliSense. But the nice thing about it is that you have this UI experience that is round trippable, and so if you've ever done WinForms development, the design is all well and good until you really want to get in there and change stuff, and then all of a sudden you end up breaking the design experience, and then you're in a world of pain because it's a nightmare. Whereas the idea behind XAML is that even for the more complex scenario, it is designed to round trip with that user experience. So that the challenge is that the tools that Microsoft originally came up with have sort of fallen by the wayside, and that there's no current plan for them to invest heavily in that. They are investing in some tools like live preview. No, it's not live preview. It's basically when you're running the app, you get a preview experience in Visual Studio of your app running, and you can click on elements, you can change them using the live tools and stuff like that. But it's very much still a developer experience as opposed to a designer experience. And so when we look at the design experience, we typically end up in one of two buckets. We typically either end up in what I call handoff, which is basically designers come up with a bunch of screens. They basically say, here's the sketch file or here's the Figma design, and developers are responsible for drilling in and trying to copy that into code. For a number of technologies, there are some Figma 2x type plugins that you can get. And so some of those make it easier to build, React apps or, web apps or whatever. But in the sort of the cross-platform, rich kind of UI experience space, there's not that many tools that service cross-platform. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have these sort of design to code. So if you look at the work that Microsoft have been doing in the sort of the Power App space, you can drag together some stuff. It looks reasonably good, but you're kind of constrained to their controls and their limited view of what styling means. And so where Uno kind of positions it, what they want to try and do is actually give the best of both worlds. So the ability to take a Figma file and then generate the code for XAML and C#, and give the designers a better grasp over what it's going to look like by giving them some tools that allow them to view it as they're designing it. And then obviously give them the ability to export the XAML so that we can ingest it into the app. But the idea there is that the XAML should be almost code complete, in the sense that the only things that you might need to do is wire up some data binding or correct some navigation and that type of thing. But the idea is that it should be as complete as it can be. So it kind of falls into two sort of buckets. There is a Figma design file that you can sort of jump onto the website and take can duplicate it for your benefit, and we'll jump in and have a look at that in a sec. And then there is a plugin into Figma that can allow you to sort of preview what your screens are going to look like, and that's using the WASM capability. So it's basically it is actually taking the XAML for the component you've written and running it up in a Uno app in WASM. And so the idea there is that the XAML that you get out of that is the exact XAML that is running on the screen. So in theory, you're so close to
the Uno controls in it.
Yeah, it does. Right. So
okay.
the previewer that you see there is actually running the Uno controls exactly.
Okay.
So, and so the idea there is that we're trying to shave off some time in terms of development. So I'll set this to play while I'm talking, so you can see some of the whiz-bang animations that we have for it. But as I say, I mean, we'll take a look at the design file in a sec. But, there is quite a lot in there, and the idea is that design is quite complex, and for us to provide a very simple template wouldn't get designers very far. So what you'll see in the template is that there is a whole bunch of things around color palettes and controls and components that you can then pull in, along with a sort of an example app that you can then use to get you started. Okay, we don't need to see the rest of that. Let's jump out and take a look at the app that you've already seen, but I'll actually show you the Figma file for it. So let's jump into Figma. Oh, hang on, let me just show you so this is the landing page for the Uno platform. So if you need to remember it, it's like Uno platform, but backwards, so platform.uno.
That's Java.
Yeah, yes. Well, it helps it's better than it being the unoplatform.com or something silly like that. Right? And so this is a good landing page for trying to access a lot of the tools. So if you want to run in VS Code, you can grab the extensions and the guides in VS Code. If you're targeting individual platforms, there's some guidance there. And for the purpose of what we're going to do now, I'm just going to step into the Uno Figma area. And the reason for that is I just want to show you where you need to go to get started. And so you can watch that video again if you want. But if you scroll down to the bottom, here's the sort of the call to action. So the idea is that firstly, you need a Figma account. which are free. So you can go and get a Figma account. And then when you click on this install the plugin, that'll take you to Figma where you can actually install the plugin. You come back here, click on the material toolkit, and go ahead and duplicate that. I'll show you that just to avoid any confusion. Hit duplicate, and that essentially takes a copy of this design file and puts it into your Figma account, which I have already done. Because I'm prepared like that, you know. And so this is the toolkit.
Is that why we've got the do not use over there?
That's right. Yes. So basically, there's the getting started page. Basically, just walks you through how you can your approach to the color styling. You know, how you can use typography, how you can structure your themes, etc. But then once you step beyond that, you can actually take a look at the various theme files. Right? So they're all here. You can scroll across and take a look at all of the different capabilities and things that come part of the platform. You can take a look at the components. So things like, you know, these are all your standard controls. So here's a button. But what you'll see down here, and this is particularly important for those who've got a design background, you'll see that it's got all of the various variants of those buttons, right? So whether it's depressed, whether it's got hover state. And this is actually quite important because coming from the WinUI or the UWP platform, the styles that we have for those, so the control templates, has all of this stuff in terms of these the visual states. And so you can go and customize and tailor and you know, completely control how each of these visual states. And so we kind of wanted to expose that as part of the components. But what you've all come to see is our example app. And so this is it's a mock commerce kind of experience. So the idea is that, you know, there's a login screen, you jump in and you see, let's see the home screen. So the home screen's got a bunch of products, you can search and, you know, apply filters. And so it's got a bunch of different pages that you can go ahead and you know, almost clone and get started with them, right? So it gives you an example how to use the Figma file. And so if I click on one of these, so let me take a look at this login button, and you'll see down here that as we change the focus here, it picks them up down here. Over on our right-hand side, we've actually got some Uno specific styling that we can apply. So I can say, okay, well, actually, I don't want my button to, I want to see what it looks like when it's, let's pick just the text button look. Don't like that. Let's go back to the filled one. But I want to see what it looks like when the mouse is hovered over it. Okay, so, you know, hover state doesn't mean everything to all of the platforms. So, for example, on iOS and Android, there is no concept of sort of this hover over state. Whereas for, you know, your desktop platforms, hover is actually quite important in terms of things like accessibility and stuff like that. So it's important to have that kind of experience there. And then once we're done with all of that, if I click on the overall page and load up the Uno platform plugin, what I can then do is go to my Play tab, and if I hit refresh on there, what it will do is it'll actually bring in, and it kind of looks the same as what it does in the Figma file, but this is the app actually running. Okay, so this is that page using actual controls for the web, obviously, because it's WASM, but they're Uno controls, right? So this is how it should look when we run up our application. And then I can flip to the XAML page, so I can copy and paste that, or I can export it. And those are that's the XAML for my page. I can then drop those into my application. And so if we take a look at our commerce app, this is the one that I had up running before. Our login page kind of looks, it's the same XAML basically, right? So, you know, for those who are really quick, you might be able to scan it and see whether it's the XAML or not. But take my word for it, right? It is. Now, the one thing that's missing out of the demo that comes with the Figma file is that, of course, it's not wired up to sort of any form of data binding. But that is stuff that is there in the plugin, so that you can actually specify what the data binding expression should be. And so again, that's trying to minimize the amount of sort of adjustments that we're making to our XAML, because the idea is that if our designer changes something, we want to be able to import that XAML with as minimal change to as possible. And so here you can see we do actually have some data binding expression. So this is bound to our sort of our credentials.username. And if we switch to our login view model, we can see that that's bound to this credentials object. Now, for those who are astute, you'll be thinking, this class is very, very empty for something that's used for data binding, right? Because it's not got any base class. It's also a record, which is weird. It doesn't have any form of implementation for iNotify property change. And what's this iState business? So one of the things that the team's been working on is this thing called reactive extensions. And the idea there is that we're trying to work as much as possible with immutable data. And so the idea is that this credentials object that gets passed around is essentially an instance of the credentials object. And as you're making changes in the UI, those messages get passed back down into the platform and resurface as a new credentials object. And so the idea is that the UI is only ever being forward bound to items that are exposed by this feed. So this iState is actually a feed. You can think of it as a sort of an observable of credentials that's keep on populating. Now, the challenge we have with data binding is that if we were to change just this credentials object every time, then if we have a deep object hierarchy, it's going to cause really bad behavior in terms of the binding with the user experience. And particularly if we think of the context with a list, if we're having a feed of a list and surfacing up a new instance of the whole list, that's going to provide a really bad experience if if the user scrolls to somewhere on the list. And so what the reactive extensions does is behind the scenes, it's actually code genning a lot of that data binding engineering to make sure that our view model is as simple as possible. So we only have the code that is specific to our app. We don't have to worry about all of that data binding capabilities. And so we've got things like a logging command. Again, remembering that this is a record, so it's not going to change all the time. We've got, sort of a very fluent syntax for basically saying when we have given a set of credentials, and when this condition equals true, so it's basically just calling this delegate here, then do login. Okay, so then do this. Okay, and in this case, we're not actually doing much to validate that this is actually a genuine login, but we're essentially navigating to the main page of our app and passing that set of credentials back. Okay. So that's the nuts and bolts of this app. Let me actually show you just the app running on the Windows platform.
And then we might jump in and pick some questions up from the chat threads.
Sounds good. Gamer Glav dropped in.
Yes, that Glav guy. Jeez.
I know. Okay, so this is our commerce app, and so this is our welcome screen. If I log in there, we'll end up with a set of deals. But basically, as I tap on those, we're kind of getting this sort of forward-backward kind of navigation going on there. Actually, let me just switch to this page, do the same. And now we have a more landscape-oriented experience, right? So we've got our product details appearing to the left, and obviously this on a higher resolution monitor, this looks better. It's like a bit quirky running on 720p, but it's all good. But interesting enough, as I reduce the screen size down, what we get is essentially the mobile experience. And so you can see here, we've switched from a sort of that navigation view on the left-hand side to actually a tab-like experience across the bottom. And so that's one of the big challenges we have, is because we support all these different platforms, we also need to start thinking about sort of a responsive design and responsive capabilities of the platform. Okay, so how many questions did I miss?
Let's go back up. MVU framework like Comet for.
There's not really. I mean, you can definitely build all of this stuff in code, like using C# as opposed to XAML. The team, we've sort of toyed with the idea of building some MVU style experience, but they're reactive extensions are kind of like a happy middle ground about that. Is the idea is that you're not generating the UI every time like you do see in some of those MVU frameworks, but you're definitely working with sort of a more immutable data that triggers off changes to that data in the back end that then causes a rebind essentially. So it's not an MVU framework specifically, but it's tackling the same kind of problem as that. Personally, I can see where they're going with Comet, but I don't feel that it meshes particularly well with all of the investment they've done in Maui and Xamarin Forms over the years. It's definitely done. I mean, if you compare to where they're at versus where Flutter is with that kind of experience, it's just chalk and cheese. No, we're not using reactive UI behind the scenes. This is, and it's not even using. I'd have to double check whether it's using the React extensions from Microsoft or not. I'm not particularly across the dev on that side of things. Uno Figma is approximately a Microsoft Blend. Yeah, I mean, essentially it solves some of the problems that Blend didn't, because it's using a tool that designers want to use as opposed to Blend that no designer really wanted to use, and then tries to bolt it. Like Blend basically was a great tool that kind of had designers bolted on, whereas Figma has the designers with kind of UI generation bolted on. So
yeah. Designers love Figma.
The browser. Yes, absolutely. So we do actually have a different sample app called the To Do app that actually uses the OAuth workflow as opposed to a built-in login experience. And definitely we didn't set out to provide any guidance on how users should log into the app. I definitely prefer to see some OAuth behavior. And particularly now that WinUI has the capability of supporting things like Microsoft, what's it called, MSAL. So if you're doing Azure authentication and stuff like that, it's basically you reference the MSAL component and it works across WinUI, works across Uno. It's a really great experience. I highly recommend
David,
that.
correct.
Yeah.
But the thing is, does anyone know? It's kind of like the tree falling in the forest.
Yeah, and it's kind of meaningless that it's installed because it doesn't do what anybody actually wants it to do anymore. So,
it takes up your space.
It's such a broken experience that nobody wants to use it anymore. I mean, look, literally, the only time I ever use Blend is to do storyboards. So if I'm doing an animation or that type of thing, I had to create a sample project, open it in Blend because my project's not going to open properly in Blend. So I create a sample UWP project. I go and create the storyboard, and then I copy it into my WinUI app, and then hope that the storyboard still works. So, because for the life of me, I can't remember how to do storyboards. I get lost somewhere between a double animation and a Anyhow,
one question: as third-party components start coming out for, say, the Maui side of things, I assume those wouldn't be usable in Uno, or are they wrappable in some way?
So that's a really interesting topic, because the notion of islands of functionality is something that is quite important across the board. And so definitely in the Xamarin Forms space, it was possible to drop Xamarin Forms components into an Uno style application. Currently, it's not possible to simply just drop a Maui control in, but it is something that the team are potentially looking at. Right now, they're looking at sort of the other end of the spectrum, which is to solve the problem that Microsoft still sticks their head in the sand and doesn't solve, which is around XAML Island. So the idea is that you have a WinForms or a WPF app, and you want to add in some, what used to be UWP. So there is a thing called XAML Island. So if you have UWP components, you can throw them into a WinForms or a WPF app. The idea would be that with WinUI and now the WinApp SDK is that you'd be able to create components or create part of your app in new style XAML and basically drop it into a sort of a WinForms or a WPF style application. And so the Uno team have been prototyping stuff, and hopefully in the 4.4 release, they're looking at bringing some of that capability forward, and we're just not sure which platforms it'll address. But definitely the nice thing about it all running on .NET 6 is that Maui stuff can co-inhabit with the Uno stuff quite nicely, because they all come from the same sort of architecture essentially. And so, some of the stuff the Maui team have done, which is around providing consolidations around images. So, typically in the past, when you created an image for a Xamarin Form app, you had to create it in 15 different sizes to accommodate the different platforms. Now you can drop an SVG and they've got a what used to be called resizitizer, I think it was called. But now it's basically you drop it in and you call it a MAUI image, and it basically generates the appropriate sizes for all of the platforms you're targeting. And so there's some of that capability that you can imagine that Uno will pick up on and actually make part of the platform.
Yep.
To leverage off that. And so conceivably, you may be able to drop an Uno app into a MAUI app or a MAUI app into an Uno thing. It's definitely possible down the line, I think. So
we might just checking the time. So we might do a few more questions and then get James to give things away.
Yeah, look, that sounds good.
Unless there's a bit more, or you're almost there.
No, we're pretty much there. I mean, I was just going to touch on the fact that the remaining parts of the platform capability are themes. So I mentioned those things earlier, talking about Material, Fluent, which is the sort of the Windows UI kind of look and feel, and Cupertino. Obviously, some of the toolkit components that we've already seen. So there's tab bars and drawers. The extensions, which we also saw in terms of that sort of booting your app and having things like logging and the dependency container and things like that, all available through your app. I think one of the big ones is navigation, and this is something that the teams worked on to try and make it really simple for to do view model to view model style navigation, or view to view, or even XAML to XAML navigation. The reactive extensions we kind of spoke about. This slide kind of brings all of those things together, and the VS Code integration. And
that said MVUX. What?
Yeah, so this is their take on it. So the idea here is that it's kind of similar to the flow of MVU in the sense that you're passing messaging down and you're getting updated state back up. But we do have this binding layer in the middle because the reality of the WinUI framework and the sort of the XAML technology is that it works particularly well with data binding. And part of the challenge in the industry has been that we haven't been able to get away from having to implement iNotify properly change a gazillion times. And so this is tackling that problem, right? So you shouldn't have to implement iNotify properly change. You can make use of these extensions with records and mutable data to take advantage of that. VS Code integration, basically, we're no longer locked to Visual Studio. You can basically grab the extensions and use those to build in VS Code. And I think that was pretty much, we just got some customer stories at the end.
And logos.
That's it.
Lots of logos.
So yeah, definitely happy to take more questions. I'll hang around for a little bit longer.
There's Andrew's last one there.
Andrew's one here.
Yep.
Look, off the top of my head, I don't know. I know that definitely the Net 6 payload is bigger than the Xamarin, like the old Xamarin payload, courtesy of the work that the team's been, like the Net team's been doing. And that's true of sort of both MAUI and Xamarin Forms. They're both suffering a little bit from that. But you'd imagine that that's going to go down as we start to get better linker, better AOT support as we move into the Net 7 timeframe, I think.
Yeah, a bit more trimming and definitely in 7. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think that was all. Have we missed any, Richard?
Not that I saw, but if there's any other questions, flick a rude emoji into the chat and we'll go back up.
Yeah, Andrew, you're probably right. It's probably around 100 megs. I don't know. Off the top of my head, But I mean, I guess one of the things that if you're working in this cross-platform space, then a lot of what we tend to find is the investments going into sort of the enterprise space. And I think the download size when you're talking about that kind of domain is not as important. Sure, it matters to customers and yeah. And so, if you're the likes of Facebook and you can afford to have teams working on each of the platforms, why wouldn't you do native, right? So, yeah, you're always going to get the optimum results that way. But at the end of the day, I mean, Uno does compile to native code for those platforms, particularly iOS where it has to be ahead of time compiled.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Nick. That was really cool.
Well, it's been lots of fun. Yes.
Yeah, very nice. I mentioned it as well.
Probably should have interrupted more and really tried to derail the presentation. But
Yeah, the only time there was any demo problems was when Richard sent you on a massive tangent.
It's a gift.
That's right. I'm somewhat annoyed because I actually had in the break between when we first connected Stream Deck and when we went on, I actually tried the iOS simulator and it was there. It's even there on the screen. It's actually there, but it's just not connected to Visual Studio anymore. Anyhow, what would a demo? What would a presentation be like without a demo?
Yeah, got to have something.
Nice to see something for UI that's not another JS framework. Absolutely. And the really nice thing about being based on Net 6 now is that all of the investment that the .NET team's doing into the BCL and the Microsoft extensions are going to be just applicable to Uno as they are to Maui. I think that's quite important. And the investment in the web space is going to be quite significant as well. In the Net 7 timeframe, we're going to get sort of tools that are part of Visual Studio that are not tied to Blazor or Uno. So you can spin up a WASM kind of app, right? Because right now, both the Uno team and the Blazor team have been responsible, essentially building out all of that team, that glue that gets WASM to work. And so it'll definitely be an improvement as .NET picks more of that up.
Definitely a watch this space thing. James, have we got giveaway questions at all?
Yes. All right. Well, you've all asked lots of questions, so now it's my turn. So
you will laugh.
So does Uno, maybe this question actually, does Uno use native controls or a canvas? Yes, I don't know if that's quite the answer. Yes, no.
It's not like it's like the tea or coffee question. You can't just answer yes because you get both put into the same cup.
Yes, I think Saf O might be the winner here.
Yep.
And Andrew's probably got enough licenses, so I think we'll give it to Saf O on that.
Safo. You got to say it like that. It's Australia.
All right. Send me your email address as a meetup message, and I'll send you through the license, please, Safo. And now Francis says, "Who knows?" All right. All good. Yes. No, I'm good. Sorry. All right. So that's the first question.
Good's a relative term, right?
A mix, actually. Tell us more.
All right.
I want to hear the story now.
Maybe the writing.
So actually just one final comment on the Net 7 stuff actually is that for anybody sort of hacking around with Uno, if they want to try out the Net 7 bits, you can actually, if you upgrade the dev server, so there's a bootstrap that's part of the Uno template. If you upgrade that to the latest dev bits, what ends up being spat out is actually a Net 7 runtime WASM app. So it's essentially Net 7 running in the browser, which is pretty cool, and it's much quicker as well. So interesting to see.
Can someone send help to Francis's place? Based on the chat, I think he's having a bit of a incident at the moment. So
I think Francis is in Spain. So
yeah, Francis, is that a call for help going on over there?
All right, next question. So what editor can you use that you can give your designers to make GUIs with Uno?
Edlin,
yes.
Emacs.
Notepad.
Emacs can do everything.
Like a not one for graphical text. Graphical controls.
Give them a command line and say they need to do it in ASCII.
Yeah, what's wrong with that, man? All right, but that wasn't what I was fishing for. It had that really quick flicky movie of all these things you can do if you're a designer.
That's how most designers work. They work that fast.
Do they? Wow. This starts with F.
Sounds like if that helps.
I was going to say, that's right. There's no stigma associated with it at all.
No, that's a big hint. The F and stigma. You put
F
those
and stigma.
together.
What? James? Family show.
All right, second letter's I. This is like I Spy. Third letter's G.
Sure, it's not like drawing teeth.
Oh, no. Big Joe, thanks, Francis. Do you really want a license, Francis? You're getting close.
Oh my, jeez, people.
Not many people working with designers here, it looks like.
My designers love.
Otherwise, you have to have the license, Richard.
I'll take it.
All right, if Lord Teaspoon.
Is that okay? Do people mind? Because we don't want to give it away to the presenters.
There it is.
Oh, Lord Teaspoon. All right. So is one license enough? All right. Yes. So as usual, send me the mail.
You can have a license for Figma, Andrew. It's free, so we're happy to give that away. Not a problem.
We'll give you a site license.
Yes, the caveat on that is I'm not sure what extent Figma is free. Like I think that there's some parts of it that you have to pay for.
Yeah, it's. Yeah.
All right, I take that back. We won't give you anything. All right. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for coming, and we're looking for speakers for next month too. So let us know if there's something you are interested in talking about, or in fact even hearing about, and we'll try and hunt someone down if that's the case.
In the nicest possible way.
Yes, in the most friendly and complimentary way. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next month.
Night.
Night, everyone.